This is part 2 of chapter 6, Socialism and Communism after Marx.
Okay, let's get into it.
We've already talked about Soviet version of communism and the way that it was using Marx's original ideas to kind of make them work for their own particular systems, their own particular goals. Let's talk about Chinese communism. In 1912, the nationalists established the independent Chinese Republic after the fall of the Qing dynasty. They then unified under Chiang Kai-shek in 1928. Communist Party had already formed as well in China, 1921. Young Mao Zedong was inspired by Lenin, primarily, as we'll see, and Stalin to a degree. We'll see some of these comparisons here in a minute. But Mao was inspired by Lenin's essay on imperialism. Mao felt that Chinese form of communism would be well suited to the Chinese conditions, had a vast majority of poor peasants, large territory with lots of resources. So he felt like that he could pursue it through an anti-imperialist war of national liberation that harnessed these long-standing resentments. So Mao was going to rely on a vast number of poor peasants who could be mobilized. They were oppressed with everything to gain. Unlike Lenin, he had a little bit better perception of the peasant class. He felt like that they did have some practical wisdom from experience and would be able to be mobilized. He also downplayed the importance of the urban proletariat, focusing more on the rural working class, and that could form a nation state that throws off the yoke of bourgeois oppressor nations. After World War II, timing apparently was right. There was a revolutionary victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1948 and 49, where Mao took control. As we've seen before, Mao's form of communism was not what Marx would have anticipated, just as it was not with Lenin and Stalin, where Marx had predicted that communism would come about as a result of the overthrow of a capitalist system. Here we just have a very large, poor peasant population that is, driven by single-minded leaders into creating this system. As I've said before, every communist system that has ever been created eventually evolves or devolves into a single-party authoritarian system. So therefore, it becomes a dictatorship of the party rather than this temporary dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx was describing. Mao also kind of sets himself up as cult of personality, proclaims the sanctity of his own vision, becomes a cult figure, magnified to mythic proportions. Had some experiments that did not turn out very well, probably following some of Stalin's ideas, using the collective farm system with Communist Party overseers. This was also in order to kind of force an industrialization process. However, because of their poor population, lack of technology, this was done through backyard furnaces that produced a very low-grade quality steel, for example. Forests had to be cut down in order to supply these backyard furnaces. Lots of erosion, lots of farmland, and because of these decisions that were made, one of the interesting ones was that the government forced farmers to kill all the sparrows because they would eat grain. However, after they killed the sparrows, the insects and the locusts then overwhelmed the farmers because they ate a lot more grain than the birds ever did. So that was just an example of several bad decisions that had been made. And over a several year period, their estimated 36 million people die from mass starvation as a result of these decisions that were made. Even as we get into the 1960s, Mao's ideas on a cultural revolution also turned out badly as well. Following Stalin, again, he felt like that ideological purity was more important than science or technical proficiency, and got rid of the scientific experts. The educated, the scientists were sent to the fields, imprisoned, and even killed. As a result of these policies, industrial agricultural production falls dramatically, and the economy is in shambles as a result of these decisions that were made under these communist experiments. Mao dies in 1976. Deng starts to open up the economy, preceding the Soviets' demise and their push to try to open their economy as well. China started the shift, but political opposition continues to be suppressed. So China is a unique model that it's a controlled capitalism, but again, a very autocratic single-party system where people do not have the same individual rights that they do in a democracy. The 1989 Tiananmen Square protests did not really alleviate much intolerance of dissent. The Chinese experiment will be interesting to watch, because if their economy starts to falter, then people will perhaps lose faith in this authoritarian system. The current leader, Xi Jinping, has also kind of set himself up similar to Putin, like a president for life. His term limits have already been extended, and there's really not much sign of increasing political liberty as long as the economic success continues along. There's a lot of people that have been brought out of poverty. As long as they are relatively successful with their controlled capitalist system, then they might be able to minimize dissent. It's a very homogeneous population as well, but it will be interesting to see what happens on that. Now let's look at some other forms of Marxism, socialism, getting into the 20th century, Western-style Marxism, where capitalism, as we've already talked about, has been more resilient and adaptive, flexible than Marx had recognized. This is one of the reasons why the capitalist systems have succeeded and becoming somewhat of the global economic system by default, because of how it is able to be used by the individual wants and needs of human beings. The welfare state has also taken off these hard edges of the competition production as well. We are still trying to look for common grounds as far as improving equality as well as increasing production. Communism in practice, as I said, has resulted in dictatorship over the proletariat. And the experiments in communism that we've seen so far are actually worse than the capitalist disease that it was meant to cure. Another form of Western Marxism, the Frankfurt School, examines the cultural, ideological factors conducive to maintaining capitalism and hindering socialist reforms. One is that mass media helps indoctrinate people into being passive workers and inert consumers. We are somewhat socialized into a system where consumption is the primary driver of our economy, and that irrational motivations and subconscious desires shape perceptions and behavior. We don't typically use rational choice all that much. Some more forms of non-Marxist socialism. As we see in the 20th century, at one time or another, putting them all together, about 1/3 of the entire world's population has lived in regimes claiming to be Marxist inspired. Looking at another form of non-Marxist socialism is anarcho-communism, perhaps pushing it a little bit to the next level of achieving these reforms, such as abolition of private property, persuading the rich to part with their wealth. Now, how you would do that, I guess that's another question. While violence is wrong, some of the anarcho-communist community would feel that, yes, violence may be required. So there's where the revolutionaries are parting with Marx's original ideas of revolution. Also, another form of this is using social Darwinism, only redefining it to say that the survival of the fittest, so to speak, would be those who are engaging in mutual aid and cooperating for the common good. People will use previous theories and then shape them as they see fit to pursue their own agendas. Christian socialism is going back and looking at the original ideas of the Christian doctrine, found a revival in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that material rewards less value than our spiritual rewards. So trying to shift the emphasis back, loving the neighbor, foregoing earthly riches, and pursuing it in a non-revolutionary manner. So Britain's Christian socialist movement was also affiliated with the Labour Party. Fairly recent Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are with the Labour Party. Also, this is somewhat associated with Fabian socialism. The Fabian Society was founded, again, back in the late 1800s. Their namesake was Fabian Maximus, Roman general, who favored wearing down the enemy instead of fighting battles. So another incremental approach here. They actually influenced the formation of the UK's Labour Party in 1900. Labour Party then actually got control of the government by 1924, and over the years had led to the nationalization of several industries such as coal and steel, the railroads, airlines, telecommunications. And while the Conservative Party of the 1980s did re-privatize some of those industries, the National Health Program remains still very popular as a socialist-inspired program in England. The Labour Party did turn a little bit more moderate under Blair in the late 1990s. As far as socialism in America, going back again to the late 1800s, when all of this was really forming, Edward Bellamy, author, looking at a futuristic utopian view of the year 2000. It was called Looking Backward, ironically, but he was projecting in the future of the year 2000 of a utopian type system where there was no money. They were using debit cards. There were state-owned stores. There was equality. There was harmony. So similar to More's Utopia, this inspired more ideas and themes. So the populist and progressive movements started to, not just this book, but lots of things were happening that I've already talked about as far as a backlash to the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age and the progressive movements that came up out of that. This was just one part of that equation. However, when we get to the real year 2000, socialism is relatively unpopular in the United States. So I guess the question you'd want to ask is why that is. One of the things that hinders any type of new movement or another party is our very entrenched two-party system. Now, that's something that I would talk about in more detail in another class, but our two-party system is firmly embedded in the American system of politics, primarily because of the single-member districts that's in the Constitution There's nothing in the Constitution that says we have to have a two-party system. In fact, when the Constitution was written, the authors, including Madison, did not envision parties as important as they are now. They considered parties as more of another faction that we have to kind of filter out with this representative system. Unfortunately, parties formed very quickly, and the single-member districts are conducive to just having two parties, as well as having to win the majority of the Electoral College. Presidential election is very much conducive to a two-party system as well, so those have solidified very much. Any third parties have a very difficult time gaining traction and getting enough votes to even win one electoral vote, much less 270 electoral votes. So that's something that we would talk about more in detail in another class, but the two-party system is going to hinder any type of alternative parties from forming. In America, we also see that most people consider themselves as middle class rather than working class. Even though our middle class is shrinking somewhat, we still consider ourselves most of us consider ourselves middle class, and that the American system is designed to have that potential for upward mobility. Now, again, in another class, we would talk about how realistic that upward mobility really is, because it does matter as to what socioeconomic strata that you're born into. But one of the more important factors in America is this liberal individualist tradition, the individual competition, the individual freedoms and property rights that makes this collectivist idea less appealing. It's almost as if that our culture has been socialized into a more individualistic-minded culture, whereas other systems have been socialized more into a collective where that's more acceptable. So that's probably the biggest thing that's hindering it. Also, the Pledge of Allegiance, ironically, was written by a cousin of Edward Bellamy, who wrote this utopian, futuristic novel. Some of the terms in the Pledge of Allegiance, such as one nation indivisible, has had to deal with lots of things: the Jim Crow laws, post-Civil War, Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist type groups, sweatshops, the robber barons of the Gilded Age. So we've had to evolve quite a bit since the Pledge of Allegiance was written in the late 1800s, around that same time as well. The phrase "under God" was not originally in the Pledge of Allegiance, but was added in 1954 at what you might consider the peak of the Cold War, when there was a lot of anti-communist Red Scares going around. More on socialism today. Socialists would insist that the American idea of the self-reliant individual is somewhat of a fantasy when you consider how much we depend on other things, and the system of profit rewards winners, punishes losers, and that the children are socialized. They're caught into this generational cycle of this individual self-reliant seeking of profit. Now, the Marxist-Leninist version of communism may be gone. We've seen the examples that Lenin, Stalin, and Mao tried that failed pretty dramatically, and then the Soviet Union collapsed as well. In 1989, as a result of that downfall of the Soviet Union, we see shifts away from communism in several states in Eastern Europe. And as I've already touched on a little bit already, China is actually more capitalist than socialist. They're the Communist Party in name primarily. They want to project the idea of a communal type system, but the Communist Party is very closed, very exclusive, and it is the dominant power, as well as most of the wealth is also members of the Communist Party as well. as I've already talked about, this non-competitive political system could be tested with growing inequality in China if the Communist Party continues to gain a disproportionate share of the wealth, or if the economic system falters for the majority of the working class, then we could see some unrest in China. It'd be interesting to see what happens on that. The collapse of the Soviet Union does suggest that centralized control of property and resources is too cumbersome and efficient. One of the advantages of the market system is letting the supply and demand of various products determine the prices. That keeps the planning and the pricing out of the hands of the government for the most part. Yes, we have to have regulations that sets up and frames this system as well, but the market can take away a lot of that from government control. The non-Marxist socialist parties have controlled governments at various times in Spain, Portugal, Austria, and Italy, all at one time or another since the year 2000. So there's still attempts at some form of socialism. The EU actually has two parties with a fairly heavy socialist influence. One of them, the second most numerous political party in the EU, is socialist inspired, as well as another one, Green Left. The market socialism, we hit on this earlier on, always looking for hybrids, blends the elements of free market with social ownership and public control of property. The key is trying to find that most productive or that most efficient mix. Major resources being publicly owned while private individuals free to own businesses. Corporate workers. Now, there are some experiments where even corporations are trying to look at perhaps even more democratic type of systems where the corporate workers would choose their supervisors and share more of the profits. However, the stigma of socialism still remains, particularly in the United States. The Great Recession did renew interest. I might talk a little bit more about the Occupy Wall Street movement, but that also kind of fell by the wayside. We are seeing somewhat of a revival in this concept of democratic socialism, particularly led by presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, as well as other politicians, AOC. Their main focus has been on universal health care and climate change, potentially two of the biggest issues that we're dealing with in our society today. That is giving them a platform to build more constituency, and it is also perhaps more palatably called social democracy, which might be a little bit less off-putting in America anyway than democratic socialism. That wraps up Chapter 6, Socialism and Communism after Marx. Stay tuned for discussion forum.